Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we take dense, critical texts and try to pull out the living application for our lives today.
Mm.
And today we are tackling a command of Christ that seems, well, it seems counterintuitive to everything we think ministry should look like, the strategy of faithful flight.
That's right, where we're heading. We're unpacking the instruction Jesus gives his disciples in Matthew 10.23 concerning persecution and the mission itself.
Okay.
And we've been immersed in, theological analyses, historical commentaries, sources that really examine the text, its theology of providence, and what it meant for the hunted church across 2 millennia.
The verse at the heart of our discussion is, it's startling in its practicality. It says, "When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly, I say to you, you will not have gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes."
It is.
And our mission here is clear. We need to get the wisdom out of this instruction. Because, our instinct, it just screams that faithfulness means standing your ground.
Right. Digging in your heels.
Refusing to move.
But the sources show a truth that sort of subverts that instinct. The goal of the mission is the continuing proclamation of the King's message.
So it's about the message, not the location.
Christ doesn't prize geographical immobility or, some kind of stubborn recklessness. He prizes obedience that secures the ongoing witness. Flight, in this context, is defined not as abandoning your duty, but as preserving your duty.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. This isn't the suggestion born of fear. It's a strategic command, and it's anchored in a sovereign promise about the future.
So before we get into the specifics of verse 23, we absolutely have to set the borders for this text.
Yes.
Matthew 10 isn't just a collection of proverbs. It's a highly unified mission discourse.
A training manual.
Yeah, a training manual. Jesus is commissioning and training the 12, his first appointed heralds, for the harsh realities of gospel labor in Israel.
Correct. We have to read this whole chapter as the foundational training manual for the apostles. It prepares them for proclamation, yes, but also for rejection, for danger, for perseverance, and in the end, for final vindication.
Mm-hmm.
And verse 23 sits as the capstone of this powerful section that starts around verse 16. It shows how the king anticipates and counters every single move of the enemy.
And the realism of Christ is just laid out right at the start. Verse 16 gives us one of the most stark metaphors in the New Testament.
He really is.
"Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves." The term "behold" isn't just filler, is it?
No, it's a command to pay attention.
Mm.
Christ is asserting a critical truth about the environment. You, the listener, need to grasp that the world, when it's confronted with the claims of the Messiah, it isn't neutral ground.
Yeah.
It is actively, structurally hostile.
And that comparison of sheep and wolves, it's so vital.
Well, sheep are defenseless. They have no natural offensive weaponry, none at all.
Their only defense is the shepherd.
The shepherd. Christ is making sure the disciples know they can't rely on their own strength or their cunning or any kind of political savvy.
Mm-hmm.
And the warnings that follow show that these wolves, they will attack, and their attacks are organized.
Okay, so let's look at that escalating opposition Jesus predicts. The logic, it's like a tightening vice around the disciples. He warns of this comprehensive conflict from both religious and civil powers. First up, religious opposition. "They will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues." That's verse 17.
And this is a practical first-century mechanism of control. The Jewish synagogue system, it retained its own judicial authority to apply discipline.
So this was real.
Oh, very real. Flogging wasn't theoretical. It was the standard punishment for offenses against Jewish law. So if the disciples preached that Jesus was the Messiah, they were immediately vulnerable to this institutional religious violence.
And it was enforced by the very communities they were trying to reach.
These very same people.
And then the hostility broadens, right? It goes beyond the local synagogue. Jesus immediately scales up the warning.
He does. To civil and governmental opposition. They will be dragged before governors and kings. That's verse 18.
Oh, now we're talking about Rome.
That brings the Roman machine into play. Governors like Pilate or Festus, kings like Herod, they represented the Gentile political structure.
This tells the disciples the conflict won't be some small internal religious argument.
Not at all. It will escalate to imperial tribunals. It will require them to bear testimony before the highest earthly seats of authority. This entire section, from the flogging to the royal decree, it lays the groundwork for verse 23.
Right.
The hostility is real, it's widespread, and it's systemic.
Given that, that fear-inducing forecast, you'd think the next instruction would be purely logistical.
Like how to hide.
Yeah, how to survive. But Christ injects a hinge of assurance right before the command to flee. He supplies the means of speech.
Verses 19 and 20 are absolute anchors for the doctrine of providence in ministry. He tells them, "Do not be anxious about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour."
For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you.
And that promise completely redefines their role.
How so?
Well, they aren't merely relying on their own cleverness or rhetorical skill. They are utterly dependent on a divine supply. The pressure of being dragged before a governor, a situation that would cause paralyzing fear in anyone, is counteracted by the promise that the Spirit will literally take over.
The Spirit will speak, the king's defense.
Yes, the moment of greatest vulnerability is also the moment of greatest divine enablement. It means that even the trial itself is just a new platform for proclamation.
So the fear of man, which normally just silences people.
It's rendered irrelevant
Yeah.
because the Holy Spirit guarantees the substance of the testimony. This is pure Reformed insight. The means of grace are supplied entirely by God's active operation.
Then, after that promise, the opposition gets even sharper. It moves from external persecution to, well, intimate betrayal.
Family against family.
Yeah, allegiance to Christ is predicted to sever the closest bonds, family against family, in verse 21. And the comprehensive hatred they'll face is explicitly for my name's sake. That's verse 22.
And that detail is so critical for the listener to understand. This is the nature of genuine persecution.
Yeah.
It is not persecution for having poor manners or for political involvement or for being arrogant.
No.
It's hatred directed specifically at the name of Christ, at his lordship, and at the claim that he alone is the Savior.
And the immediate instruction, right before we get to the command to flee, is the requirement for steadfastness.
The one who endures to the end will be saved.
And this is why the command to flee in verse 23 isn't some escape hatch.
It is endurance's strategy. Endurance is not defined by remaining physically stationary until they kill you. Endurance is defined by continuing to confess Christ faithfully wherever God's providence directs you.
So if fleeing to the next town preserves your life and allows the witness to continue,
that is enduring. If staying means the immediate and, needless extinction of the message, that is presumption, not faithfulness.
So the persecutor is aiming for silence and immobility.
Right.
But Christ's command actively ensures the message stays mobile. It gathers the whole context of hostility, dependence on the Spirit, and the call to endurance into one practical instruction.
You are sheep among wolves, but the shepherd dictates the path, and sometimes that path involves rapid relocation.
Okay, let's do a close reading of the actual command here because the language really matters. The instruction is, "Betreter et etan, flee into the other city." The verb hew is used as a present active imperative. So what does that grammatical structure tell us about the command?
Well, the present active imperative isn't a one-time suggestion. It's a continuous standing order for the duration of the mission.
So it's a habit they're supposed to form.
It implies a habitual response to opposition. It is the directive for the obedient servant. This isn't permission for the timid. It's the king's tactical instruction to his field agents.
They aren't supposed to wait for martyrdom.
No. They are to treat persecution as the signal to shift the center of their operations.
And the direction is key too. To the next is tan heterin.
Yes.
The flight isn't toward a silent bunker or some anonymous hiding place. It's directed toward continuity of witness.
You don't abandon the mission circuit. You just shift the location of the pulpit. The persecutor wants to stop the word.
And Christ ensures the word stays mobile.
Resilient. And virtually impossible to extinguish. If they succeed in shutting down the gospel in Capernaum, the disciples are immediately commanded to open up a new front in Bethsaida.
So this mobility is just built right into the perseverance required for the mission.
It is.
This instruction, then, it acts like a fence. It confronts and contains two opposite errors that are always tempting believers away from obedient faithfulness.
We call them the dual idols. On one side, you have the idol of fanaticism.
Okay, what does that look like?
This is spiritual pride that actively courts persecution, that seeks martyrdom, or engages in needless confrontation just to prove sincerity or, bolster the ego.
So a zealot might argue that fleeing shows a lack of faith.
But Christ teaches that to refuse the provided means of escape is presumption, not courage.
I can just imagine that in the early church, especially under severe Roman oppression, there would have been people who felt they had to prove their devotion by standing still, even when a clear escape route was available.
Absolutely. The early church had to deal with this challenge later. especially in the Decian and Diocletian persecutions. You had figures who ran headlong into the persecution, demanding to be martyred.
And the church fathers cautioned against that.
Often, yes. They argued it wasn't obedience, but self-will. Jesus does not recruit showmen or egotists who are just looking for a glorious exit. He wants faithful witnesses.
Okay, so that's one idol. What's on the other side?
On the opposite side, the instruction confronts the idol of cowardice.
This is the faithless retreat.
Yes, the flight from confession that results in silence, compromise, or outright denial of duty. This coward wants a theology that justifies his fear, a quiet escape that lets him abandon the flock or deny the king when it gets inconvenient or dangerous.
So the difference between these two idols, it really hinges on the motivation and the destination.
Completely.
Let me see if I have this right. If I leave a town because I want to keep preaching somewhere safer, that's strategic flight.
Mm-hmm.
If I leave a town and take a vow of silence just to maintain my comfort and safety,
Yeah.
that's retreat and cowardice.
You've got it. We see that prudence, in this context, it's not the opposite of faith. It's an act of obedience rooted in faith that trusts God's scheduling and his methods.
To refuse every door of escape is actually testing God.
Yes. You're assuming that you know his timing better than he does, and you're forcing a premature end to your witness.
It's humbling when you realize that even the Lord of the church, the one who walked willingly to the cross, he practiced strategic withdrawal.
He did. We often hold up this image of Christ just marching rigidly toward his fate. But Matthew records that when opposition sharpened after the healing of the man with the withered hand, what did Jesus do?
Jesus withdrew from there, Matthew 12:15.
And John's gospel notes that he wouldn't walk openly in Judea at one point because his hour had not yet come. This is not fear of man. It's submission to the Father's sovereign timetable.
So if the Son of Man recognizes and respects the temporal boundaries of his mission,
how much more should the servants respect the boundaries given to them?
That distinction, submission to providence versus fear of man, that's the key.
It is. If our purpose is to glorify God by finishing the work he gave us, then preserving our life to finish that work is obedient.
And we see the apostles adopt this strategy over and over.
We do. Think about Paul's experience in Damascus. After his conversion, the Jews plotted to kill him. How did he respond? Did he stubbornly stand on the wall and wait for their spears?
No. He was lowered down the city wall in a basket, Acts 9.
The great apostle Paul escaping in a basket. It is such a visual challenge to our idea of heroic ministry.
It doesn't look very dignified.
Not at all. But it was a preservation of the man for the continuation of the mission. It was obedience.
And there's a similar example later in Iconium, right?
Yes. When Paul and Barnabas found out about a plot by both Gentiles and Jews to stone them, they didn't wait around for the mob. They fled. But they fled specifically to Lystra and Derbe.
And the very next sentence records that they continued to preach the gospel there.
They preserved the gospel, not their physical security in that one location.
But we have to stress, as you noted, the pattern isn't simplistic. Sometimes obedience does mean staying.
Of course.
We see Peter and John choosing to remain and face the Sanhedrin, and we definitely see Stephen, who stood his ground and bore witness until death.
Which brings us back to the role of sanctified wisdom and discernment. The decisive question is not, will I look brave to the people watching? It's what course of action, staying or moving best, serves the continuous, faithful witness to Christ under God's governing hand.
Prudent perseverance flees with confession intact. Faithless retreat flees from confession.
The new city is not a bunker. It is the next pulpit.
And there's a beautiful element of divine reversal here, too. Persecution, which the enemy intends as disruption.
It becomes distribution. The hostility drives the gospel further afield than the disciples might have dared to go otherwise. The king uses the wolves to scatter the sheep, making sure the seed is planted in new soil.
Now, this strategic flight is given a hard boundary by the text, which brings us to a major interpretive guardrail, the cities of Israel.
Yes, toi stoiles.
This isn't just generic advice for all time. It anchors the mission to a specific territory and a specific time in God's redemptive order.
And that specificity prevents us from turning the verse into some abstract aphorism that applies equally to every believer in every age without thinking about the context. The disciples are operating within the covenant nation, among the people who receive the law, the prophets, and the promises. The persecution they face is intrinsically tied to Israel's unique position.
That geographical restriction forces us to look back at the explicit commission boundaries Jesus set just a few verses earlier.
In Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6.
Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
And this highlights Israel's unique role in salvation history. The gospel arrives first, historically, fulfilling promises made specifically to the fathers. This initial mission is therefore a covenant confrontation.
What do you mean by that?
The king is forcing the nation that possesses the greatest light to face a decisive crisis point. Will they accept their Messiah, or will they reject him? The mission has to start exactly where God placed covenant privilege.
So the specificity of this mandate is a critical juncture for understanding broader theological framework. Our sources highlight that the mission defined here, which is strictly geographically and ethnically bounded, is distinct from the universal scope of the later Great Commission.
The one in Matthew 28:19.
Right, which commands the disciples to disciple all nations.
And this distinction is a hallmark of what's often termed a dispensational framework, the idea that God manages the unfolding of his redemptive plan through successive arrangements or dispensations. Matthew 10 represents a particular phase, focusing on Israel's offer of the kingdom.
And that restriction, the cities of Israel, is a clear marker of that phase.
It is. This leads directly into the relationship between the church and Israel. The fact that this specific Israel-focused prophecy continues, the fact that the evangelization of national Israel is designated as an active program right up until the Son of Man comes.
It's often cited as evidence against replacement theology.
Yes. For clarity for our listeners, replacement theology, or supersessionism, is the view that the church has permanently replaced or fulfilled the role of ethnic Israel in God's plan.
So, in that view, there's no longer a distinct future for the physical nation of Israel.
Correct.
So how does Matthew 10.23, specifically the part about running out of cities, how does that bear weight on this discussion?
Well, if the church had entirely replaced Israel, then Christ's instruction to his disciples about exhausting the cities of Israel before his return would be, functionally meaningless.
Because that geographical boundary would have dissolved after the cross.
But because Matthew 10.23 specifically limits the mission to Israel right up to the return of the Son of Man, it implies that the task concerning Israel is still active, contested, and ongoing, even if the primary gospel witness has now expanded to the Gentiles.
So Scripture reminds us that God's gifts and calling to Israel are irrevocable.
A key truth for Reformed thinkers who accept the authority of Romans 11.29.
So the phrase cities of Israel acts as a timestamp and a geographical marker. It reminds us that this urgent, bounded circuit within a defined territory, it points toward a decisive divine vindication.
And that's where the mission will conclude, not by failure, but by the king's arrival.
And there's that prophetic irony we touched on.
The very mechanism designed to shut down the mission in Israel persecution becomes the tool that accelerates the transition to the Gentile mission.
Right. In Acts 8, Saul's persecution scatters the church.
But those scattered immediately preach the word wherever they go. Rejection in one sphere becomes the catalyst for proclamation in another.
Just like when the leaders of Israel rejected Paul's message in Acts 13.
What was the result? Paul and Barnabas turned to the Gentiles. Christ turns the enemy's opposition into the very means of distribution. He uses the violence of the wolves to advance the gospel.
Okay, here's where we get to the most theologically challenging part of the text.
The time marker.
The specific horizon Jesus sets for this mission. You will not have gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. This is the critical interpretive crux that has generated centuries of debate.
It has. And the first and most important step for any listener who adheres to the authority of Scripture is to affirm the inerrancy and omniscience of Christ. We have to immediately reject the conclusion of liberal critical scholarship, which, dating back to thinkers like Albert Schweitzer, claim that Jesus was a mistaken apocalyptic prophet.
That he genuinely expected his physical second coming, the Parousia, to happen within the immediate lifetime of the 12.
And that view just fundamentally attacks the deity of Christ. If Jesus, the Son of God, was mistaken about the timing of cosmic events, then his authority collapses.
So the difficulty of the text must not lead us to adopt a low Christology.
No, Jesus was not wrong. We are challenged to understand the nature of biblical prophecy, which often uses language in layered ways.
So to understand the timing, we have to first appreciate the weight of the title Jesus uses here.
Son of Man, hoios tu anthropou. This is not just a modest self-reference, it's a direct allusion to Daniel 7.
Daniel 7.13 and 14, where the Son of Man is granted eternal dominion and receives a kingdom.
So the coming of the Son of Man is loaded with this imagery of authority, judgment, and vindication. It is the king asserting his scheduled arrival to take up his rule and deal with his enemies.
And the grammar, "Asam till comes," it sets a genuine future boundary.
It does. The command to flee is grounded in a sovereign promise about the final state of affairs. They are moving because the king is coming, and his arrival dictates the pace and the conclusion of the mission.
So the consensus among many scholars who affirm inerrancy is that the strongest interpretation uses the concept of prophetic foreshortening.
Right.
I think we owe our listeners a moment to really clarify what that means.
It's a visual analogy, really.
Yeah.
Imagine you're standing in a valley and you see two distant mountain peaks that are aligned perfectly from your vantage point.
Okay.
They appear to be touching, or maybe one continuous ridge. But as you get closer to them, you realize there's a massive, unknown valley, maybe centuries of history, separating those two peaks.
I see.
Biblical prophecy often blends an immediate historical fulfillment with the final consummative one. Both are comings, but one is an installment of judgment, and the other is the culmination of glory.
And Matthew specifically uses coming language in ways that refer to both the ultimate final appearing and also sometimes to historical acts of judgment,
Which establish Christ's royal authority. This leads us to the layered interpretation, the near horizon and the final horizon.
Okay, what's the near horizon?
The near horizon coming relates to the historical judicial vindications that the disciples would experience within the span of their mission and lifetime.
So what were these specific comings that showed Christ's royal authority?
Primarily, the resurrection and enthronement of Christ, followed by Pentecost, the Spirit-empowered expansion of witness. But most pertinent to the Jewish mission described here in Matthew 10 is the covenant judgment upon Jerusalem in AD 70.
AD 70, the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem by the Roman armies under Titus. Why is that event considered an installment of the Son of Man comes?
Because it was a definitive historical act of judgment against the nation that had rejected its Messiah. Jesus himself talks about this coming judgment in Matthew 24, using language often conflated with his final return,
And the destruction of the temple ended the sacrificial system.
conclusively demonstrating that Christ's priesthood and kingdom had arrived and that the old covenant order was now obsolete. For the disciples of that time, this was a massive, visible vindication of Christ's authority against the very religious powers that had sought to stop their mission.
It was a coming in judgment upon their immediate persecutor.
That's right. So the command to flee ensures that the disciples remain active and scattered throughout the cities of Israel right up until that decisive historical judgment of AD 70.
Which would have temporarily disrupted the Israel mission.
And that's one strong interpretation. However, and this is key, we must not let that near horizon replace the final horizon. The AD 70 judgment foreshadows, but it does not replace the literal, physical, cosmic second coming.
When the Son of Man appears in glory as judge and king, as Matthew 24 and 25 describe. So the full weight of the text is saying, you won't finish the evangelization circuit of Israel before two things happen. First, Christ executes historical judgment on the nation.
AD 70.
And second, the final glorious parousia occurs. The mission is active right up until the king returns in glory.
Yes. And the limitation, you will not have gone through all the cities, assures the disciples and the future Jewish remnant of a few critical things.
Yeah.
It assures them the mission field will remain contested and active. They will always be pursuing the lost sheep of Israel right up until the moment of the king's glorious return. The king arrives while the work is still in progress, not after it's all been neatly completed.
And that certainty, it just fundamentally changes how we view persecution.
It's the anchor of hope.
It means the wolves may chase you from city to city, but they operate entirely within Christ's timetable. The king governs the road. He dictates the end of the story.
The disciple doesn't measure success by whether one hostile town receives the message, but by whether he faithfully obeyed the king who is scheduled to arrive.
If the king is coming, your labor is not in vain.
And if the king governs when he comes, he also governs your path of flight. It completely integrates the theology of mission with the doctrine of divine sovereignty.
So let's move to the application for the 21st century church. What does Matthew 10.23 press into our thinking, particularly for us who approach Scripture from a Reformed perspective?
It presses a robust, practical doctrine of providence. The king governs our movements, and this is a vital corrective to the two errors of human-centered ministry: fatalism on one side and practical Arminianism on the other.
Okay, unpack that a little.
We are not fatalists who simply wait for destiny to happen, Nor are we practical Arminians who act as though everything depends entirely on our own human boldness.
So we, as servants of Christ, we can use all lawful, ordinary means, prudence, relocation, planning, without the fear of failing spiritually or being seen as weak in faith.
Yes, God ordains not only the end of our mission, but also the lawful means, and that includes doors of escape. When a clear door of escape is provided, to refuse it isn't faith, it's tempting God.
We rely on the absolute government of Christ over the earth.
If he allows persecution, he also retains the right to command strategic relocation. Our boldness isn't found in staying when we should go, but in maintaining the confession wherever you're called to be.
This really clarifies missional perseverance for us today. Endurance is not stubborn geographical immobility.
No. Endurance is remaining faithful to the confession, refusing to deny, continuing to witness whether the Lord calls us to stay and suffer or commands us to move and preach in the next location.
Jesus provides a mandate that is neither capitulation to fear nor, bravado rooted in pride.
And this has immediate application for ministry today. Think about a pastor in a hostile region. If he stays and is quickly imprisoned or killed and the work just stops, that might be seen as presumption.
Right.
But if he flees to the next village where the gospel has not yet been planted, ensuring the survival of the witness, that is obedience.
But how do we distinguish between strategic flight and cowardice in a more modern, less overtly violent environment? For instance, say I'm a lay leader facing intense cultural opposition in my workplace. If I leave that job for an easier one, is that fleeing to the next city, or is that just sacrificing confession for comfort?
And that's a great question. The critical distinction, as established in the source texts, is the motive and the destination.
Okay.
Paul and Barnabas fled to a new preaching venue. If your motivation for leaving the hostile workplace is to secure comfort or silence, that's retreat.
But if my motivation is to secure a new, viable platform for witness,
Perhaps moving to a job in a different industry or state where you can be a more effective, sustained witness.
then that aligns with the Matthew 10 instruction.
Yes. The key is preserving the duty of witness, even if you sacrifice the location of the witness.
That helps to expose a very modern idol, the idol of comfort.
When safety is chosen over confession, when believers are tempted to value their earthly security, their professional standing, or their social acceptance more than the Master's mission, they stand condemned by this text.
And we have to equally address the idol of pride, or the spiritual fanaticism we discussed.
Right. That's when we pick unnecessary fights, provoke local authorities through recklessness, and then try to label the consequences of our own poor judgment as persecution for righteousness.
Christ's persecution is hatred that arises explicitly for my name's sake, not the backlash from being needlessly antagonistic.
So the church today must train its people before the crisis hits. This means cultivating resilient doctrine, a doctrine of sovereignty that governs our movements, and, where it's appropriate, building discrete, secure networks.
So that when persecution does arrive, the first instinct isn't panic.
But disciplined, strategic movement aimed at gospel preservation.
Let's talk about the ecclesiological implication of Matthew 10.23. The church is commissioned to advance through word-centered proclamation and the Spirit's ordinary help, not through spectacle or gimmicks designed to avoid offense.
The offense of the gospel is the king's claim, that Jesus is Lord, not necessarily our tone. The solution to rising opposition is never to rebrand the gospel or soften the truth to make it less offensive to the wolves.
So the instruction is to maintain clear, plain, unashamed proclamation.
And when that proclamation is forcibly silenced in one location, you relocate so that the truth continues to be heard in the next.
So finally, how do we guide the conscience in those high-pressure moments? What is the clearest rule for discerning faithful flight from sinful retreat?
The simple rule derived from our sources and the apostolic examples is this. Flee when staying would mean the needless silencing or premature extinction of witness, or a denial of Christ's name.
Okay.
But never flee in order to deny Christ or abandon the people God has entrusted to you. If your flight leads you to another city to preach, it is obedience.
If your flight leads you to permanent silence, it is sin.
Wisdom is sanctified judgment made under the authority of Scripture, informed by prayer and guided by counsel. If imprisonment would end the work prematurely, then flee to the next is obedience. If leaving would abandon the flock without a shepherd, then staying is obedience.
In every case, the ruling objective is the preservation and continuation of the gospel testimony.
Until the king arrives. So Matthew 10.23 stands as a monumental passage that resolves the paradox for the hunted church. Flight is obedience when it secures the duty of witness, because the shepherd who directs the paths of the sheep is wiser than the wolves that hunt them.
We're not victims of chance. We don't labor in vain.
Hmm.
The grand conclusion rests on the certainty of that time marker until the Son of Man comes.
Hmm.
Persecution does not signal mission failure. It signals mission advance under a sovereign king who uses the enemy's rage to scatter the seed even further.
The persecutor can certainly drive the herald from one city, but he cannot, in the end, outrun the coming king. The Son of Man governs the entire road. The opportunities, the opposition, the scattering of his servants, and the final glorious vindication of his name.
And that theological certainty, it frees us for steady, disciplined obedience.
To speak the truth without apologizing. To move when necessary without shame, and to suffer when required without panic.
Jesus confronts you, the listener, with a fundamental choice of allegiance. The world says, be safe. Your own weak flesh might say, be seen. But Christ commands, be faithful. Therefore, keep the gospel moving. Keep your conscience clean by refusing both fanaticism and fear, and keep your eyes fixed upon the Son of Man, who will vindicate every word spoken in his name. Because his coming is sure, and his sovereign timing dictates the end of the story.